Hello, and welcome back to Owoh's Corner, my own little corner of art. If you were born in the 90s or early 2000s, you were probably a kid who watched cartoons growing up. Hey Arnold, Rocco's Modern Life, or maybe you watched shows like Code Lyoko or Naruto growing up. If you did watch a lot of cartoons and anime, I'm guessing you couldn't really tell anybody. Your parents were probably too busy or they weren't interested. Your classmates? They probably called you weird, maybe even bullied you. So, someone had to ask, what is with all the animosity? Why do so many people think cartoons are for kids? Why is animation avoided as a medium in the West? In this video, I will share with you the socio-political, economical, and anthropological history of the United States, and use our American history to discover why people think cartoons are made for kids. So please, sit back, grab some popcorn or a snack, and enjoy The Origin of Cartoons Are Made for Kids, a Western Mentality. For starters, animation is a form of artistic representation. Animation is the illusion of movement using multiple still images in a sequence. It started with toys, little tools and knickknacks. The thaumatrope, invented by John Ayrton Paris in 1824, a piece of paper with two different images on either side, and spinning it fast would give the illusion of motion or one object overlapping the other. Next was a zootrope, which was invented in 1834 by William Horner, a wheel of multiple pictures on a drum that can be spun and viewed through a slit or hole. Compared to the thaumatrope, the zootrope had more images and could be viewed for longer periods of time. Lastly, there was phantasmagoria, which can be considered the first widely distributed animation. It was featured in theaters and cinema. It was created in 1908 by Emil Cole. Again, it used multiple hand-drawn images using paper. This time, however, they were played back on negative. The lines were white and the background black. These early precursors to animation had much attention and acclaim. People, young adults and grown adults, would carry around thaumatropes to pass the time, make events of going to a cinema to view phantasmagoria and other doodle animations. Through practice and development and the advent of new tools and technologies, it has helped entertainment grow and expand. The first Western colored film was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It was new, magical. In 1938, it shook things up in the West. Disney and its films hosted colors and narratives that brought people together. During World War II, soldiers would watch Disney films, cartoons, and read comics. Many people talk about propaganda during that time, but cartoons were also a way of boosting morale. And looking back, early Disney films were in fact graphic. Snow White showed references to drugging as well as someone getting crushed to death. Maleficent showed a stabbing and had animated blood. Bambi, which came out in 1945, had the mother of the main character die. Also, the first serialized animation was being produced and distributed in the 1960s. Crusader Rabbit, The Jetsons, The Flintstones, and others. So then, if there was such a love for animation, and early on it had such graphic imagery, how is it that now people bat their eyes and turn their heads? I started my research by first looking at the present. Let us flash forward for a second. Who is really pushing this narrative? Parents of 90s and 2000s kids, news anchors, producers, showrunners who are running stories or making live action remakes of animated films. These people are in between their 40s and 60s, late boomers and Generation X. Boomers were born between the 1950s and 1960s. Generation X was born between the mid 1960s and the 1980s. So I asked myself, what were the boomers and Generation X going through? To answer that question, I did some research on the mid 1900s and found out that some of the most formative years for these people was the hippie movement and the civil rights movement. After World War II, in 1955 was the beginning of the Vietnam War. Boomer youths held anti-war sentiment and were avidly against conflict. That, along with the racial divide, stressed racial relations in the West, and it gave birth to the anti-war, anti-conflict hippie movement and the civil rights movement around the 1960s. Though both movements had overlap in ideals, the hippie movement can best be described as focusing on anti-war campaigns, recreational drug use, counterculture, and rejecting the mainstream. The civil rights movement mainly addressed the civil liberties and the infringement of liberties on minorities, primarily Black African Americans, Jim Crow, Black codes, and other policies and biases. You may have gone over this in your high school history classes. These are teenagers and young adults who are fighting for freedoms, what they think is right, for expression and freedom. So, what happened afterwards? The hippie movement and civil rights movement both had remarkable success, together and as their own movements separately. Policies were made and mentalities were shifted. Even though we may still face a few roadblocks today, what came from the civil rights and hippies certainly were the first steps. However, what was to come afterwards was the waning of the hippies and the rise of the Yuppies. The Yuppie movement began in the 70s, featuring young people as professionals. A paradox happened in the hippie movement. Counterculture became culture. There was less of a need to be activists at the time, so now young people had to get jobs. The Yuppie movement was the time of the stereotypical American, career-centered men and women, higher wages, everyone making five figures, recreational drug use, owning nice homes and cars. Overall, the need or desire to be seen as adult and serious, having your life together. With the economic boom of the Yuppie movement, several tax cuts were given out, primarily to the rich. It was believed early on that these tax cuts would trickle down. Sadly, they did not. On top of that, and unemployment, particularly amongst minorities, this has led to the rise of gang culture in the 1980s. Gang culture, which was primarily inner city poverty. A strength in numbers, if you will. Gangs were originally made for survival and to provide a sense of belonging. Only later did it shift into far more illicit activities. Now, let us get into millennials. The millennial generation was born between 1981 and 1996. They were born to, and their mentalities were shaped by, the late boomers and early Generation X before them. Similar to the upbringing of Generation X, the latchkey kids, there was limited adult supervision, leading to heightened independence. But at the same time, given the values of the Yuppies, there was also the importance of education and higher learning for careers. Formative events for the millennials were gay rights and abortion, as well as bodily autonomy. Again, the youth fighting for freedoms and liberties, similar to Generation Z in our present day. There was also the technological revolution in the 80s, which had the creation of CDs, personal computers, boom boxes, and other devices. The technological revolution also allowed for national and international exchanges of information, this being dubbed the Wild Decade in the 90s. The Wild Decade, the 1990s, also saw the exercising of freedom of speech, as well as art as a form of protest. Kiss, rock music, the Beatles, Elvis, and other forms of film and music. Now we have this push for acceptance, civil rights, recreational drug use, feminism, abortion, gay rights. Overall, a shift from a traditional mindset and values to modernity. However, not everyone viewed this as a good thing. In the early 80s, Jerry Falwell, a Baptist minister, started the Moral Majority. The Moral Majority viewed the hippie and yuppie movements, gay rights, gang culture, feminism, and other modernist developments as a moral decline and acted against them, trying to restore traditional values. This was the beginning of televangelists and televangelism, the influx of TV sermons, religious practitioners as public speakers, and the writing of companion books and novels. While the Moral Majority was in fact able to garner a following and influence, they made more enemies and detractors. The Moral Majority's lasting impacts were reintroducing religion into the public debate and the Satanic Panic. The Satanic Panic stems from the ideologies of the Moral Majority. Essentially, the Satanic Panic, and by extension, the Moral Majority, never ended. The Satanic Panic was an attack on something known as satanic ritual abuse, the belief that certain music, clothing styles, and forms of media were inherently evil, of the devil, and an attempt to contact Satan. An attack on books and movies like The Satan Seller by Mike Wank and the popular movie The Exorcist. There were attacks on Dungeons and Dragons, a popular tabletop role-playing game, Pokemon, which is a popular TV series and video game series, and other TV shows and games. The most extreme and likely well-known incident is the case of the West Memphis Three, who were three teenagers convicted of murdering three boys in 1993 in a satanic ritual, suspected simply on the basis of their style of dress. Holistically, the Satanic Panic, and by extension, the moral majority, is predicated on the failure to view art metaphorically. They took everything as literal without nuance. I haven't talked much about animation. I promise I'm getting there. This was meant to lay the groundwork, give you guys some background knowledge and track behavior. So now, why does everyone think that cartoons are for kids? My final theory, my final conclusion is it is a combination of religious mentalities as well as the shift towards society in the West being career-centric. The first serialized cartoon aired in 1960, Crusader Rabbit. Generation X, the latchkey generation, was known for staying home with little parent supervision, but they and the boomers will later become the hippies and civil rights activists. After finding success and making strides, they had to shift into focusing on their futures and careers. The Yuppie movement. They had to grow up, be professional, and lessen or entirely stop their childish interests. These same people had the Millennials. Both parents still working, they became independent as well. Millennials had both mom and dad work, and they were left home alone. When they are done with their homework or whatever work they have, they are likely watching TV, cartoons, He-Man, Thundercats, Hey Arnold, and others. So these parents, these Generation X and late boomer parents who have been pushed to focus on their career with work the next day, as well as house chores, dinner, and other things they need to complete other projects, they don't think much of it. In fact, some may think their children are just wasting time and doing nothing. When mentioning the Wild Decade and art as metaphor, people think of rock music, Kiss and the Beatles, Elvis, but what people often forget is cartoons. Recall in the 80s and 90s, public service announcements in cartoons. Subtext and serious issues in kid shows like Stranger Danger, Body Image, and Abuse. Messages that millennials and 90s kids were watching. So you have the use of art as protest, the Satanic Panic's inability to view art metaphorically, and inattentive parents, which leads to the solidification of the dismissal or outright villainization of animation. This has led to the streamlining and simplification of Western animation into comedy-centered products. The many children-centric shows on Disney Junior, Nick, Nick Jr., Cartoon Network, and PBS Kids, as well as comedy-centered adult media on TBS and Adult Swim, along with the wave of live-action remakes to classic Disney films, which began in 2018. The problem lies in the fact that as one matures, yes, your interests change, but more than likely, your interests and tastes refine. Cartoons are not simply for kids. The early 2000s saw the rise of the Toonami block, which exposed anime to Western audiences. Eastern anime inherently has a teenager and young adult focus, which primarily centers on complex characters, character development, and overarching stories. The same elements that are present in many loved and respected live-action movies and TV shows. While the stories of live-action products have garnered much acclaim, only recently has Western animation begun to catch up. Steven Universe and Adventure Time aired in 2013. It began as comedic, but quickly evolved into complex storytelling. Gravity Falls in 2014 is also highly respected, as well as an animated web series by the name of Ruby, also made in 2014. Between 2018 and 2020, independent creators have arisen to produce fully animated products and stories on YouTube. Hell of a Boss, Has Been Hotel, Long Gone Gulch, Murder Drones, Pork Chop and Flat Screen, and many others. In very recent history, Netflix has opted to produce and distribute their own animated series. Of the most popular, Dota 2, Dragon's Blood, and Arcane League of Legends, the latter of which has garnered international mainstream acclaim across YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. There have been many questionable and horrific movies and live action scenes. 2007's The Girl Next Door, Cuties, I Spit on Your Grave, which I believe would have less scrutiny if they were in an animated format. Not even solely talking of scrutiny, but there are many things you can do in animation that is hard to do in live action. Coloring, lighting, exaggerated expressions, compositions, and the range of dynamic actions for your characters and scenes. I could go on forever, talk about this subject forever, but the point of this video is not to shame live action and praise anime as the second coming. I researched and made this video so that I could finally find out why so many people think cartoons are for kids, why there are not many animated shows from the West with deeper stories. Even though there is a shift and people are making more animated media, we still have a long way to go. I hope you all enjoyed my video. Please sure to like, comment, subscribe, share even. Anyway, this has been Owoh's Corner, my own little corner of art. I'll see you in my next video. Bye.